Hello, welcome to the first episode of Zilog and Moto Season 5. Man, that's a crazy thing to say. I'd always hoped that when I started the channel that I'd still be doing this into 2023 and beyond because, that was the whole plan. But I've seen so many people try to start channels and projects in that time span and then just poof, they're gone. And that's nothing against them. I certainly had no idea the amount of time and effort that this would take when I started out. And let's be real, life happens. One day you've got big plans and the next day a pandemic starts. Boy, that's a crazy thing to think about. I've been doing this channel now since before the pandemic hit, which seems like another lifetime ago. Anyway, enough of me rambling. If this is your first visit to Zilog and Moto, welcome, and I hope that you enjoy your stay and have a great rest of the year for 2023 or whatever year it is when you're watching this video. My name is Dave, and Zilog and Moto is my project to collect and review complete copies of every English language game released in the 8 and 16-bit era of Sega consoles, so I'll be attempting to cover the libraries of the Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. These reviews feature gameplay captured on original hardware when possible, and a look at the package itself, from the days when printed manuals were still a thing. For the schedule of Zilog and Moto, I try to upload a video every week, and sometimes I have that schedule built out ahead of time of what games I'm going to look at when. A good example of that is when I review games that are from the same series, I try to space them out every 100 episodes or so because that keeps a good variety in the reviews, and it also gives me time between the titles in a series to get a fresh perspective on the game. The game that I had originally picked to review this week was one of those cases, as I was planning on reviewing European Club Soccer, the obviously European version of World Trophy Soccer that I looked at back in episode 82. And you might think it's a little bit odd for me to review a game that I technically have already looked at, but in the case of European Club Soccer, there's a pretty significant reason as to why I'm doing it, and technically I have done something similar before, looking at both Electronic Arts NHL Hockey and its European version EA Hockey in separate videos. However, as you can probably tell by the title slide and name of this video, this review is not for European Club Soccer, which I'm still going to get to review that later on, just not right now. No, instead, this week's review is instead in honor of Pele, the Brazilian soccer legend that unfortunately passed at the end of 2022. Now, I've heard some people say some not so nice things about this game, so we'll just see how in honor this review is, but I still think it's appropriate to cover the game now because it's the thought that counts, right? Maybe. Anyway, Pele. And you've got to get that exclamation point in there at the end of the title, as you're an announcer cheering as if he'd just scored a goal, was released in the United States by Accolade in December of 1993, just in time for Christmas that year, and then in Europe shortly thereafter. This, of course, was a timed release on Accolade's part, as the world, and especially the United States, was starting to gear up for the coming 1994 World Cup, and they weren't the only ones with that idea, as the first iteration of a certain FIFA franchise was also released within a few weeks of each other. So, was Pele a decent effort that lives up to the greatness of the late namesake? Or is it just a cash grab that's as bad as you probably think? Well, we shall see. But first, a look at the package. And this is my copy of Pele for the Genesis. As you can clearly see, Pele was released early on in Accolade's history with Sega, and because of that, it came in one of Accolade's cardboard boxes. These boxes were unique on the console because they were constructed similar to an early PC game box, with the box consisting of two pieces, rather than just a lid that opens at the top and the bottom. This is actually pretty common for an Accolade release, and I'm fairly certain that they have more cardboard box releases than clamshell releases. To illustrate that fact, we've previously seen this style box used for Hardball, Hardball 3, and way back in Super Off-Road. In fact, that reminds me, we're very much overdue for a look at the Master System version of Super Off-Road. I need to make that happen this year. Anyway, I actually like these boxes a lot, and I vastly prefer them to any of the other cardboard boxes that were used with Genesis titles, because unlike the Sega and Electronic Arts boxes, these are made of pretty sturdy cardboard, and you've really got to make a mistake to crush one of these. Unfortunately, as durable as this cardboard is, the print is still susceptible to scuffing, and there is definitely a bit of wear to the front and back, but thankfully it doesn't look too bad. I like this cover and artwork. The logo is cool and really stands out, complete with that exclamation point I was talking about. Seeing that reminds me of how the original Hardball had an exclamation point at the end too, so Accolade definitely seemed to have a thing for emphasizing their names. The picture is a nice action shot of Pele going for the ball on the pitch, with what appears to be from when Brazil was playing Cameroon at some point. I say appears to be because Accolade messed with the picture a bit and edited the logos on the front of the jerseys and changed the colors of the collars so not to run afoul of any national team licensing issues. And this will make sense when I get into the actual review. Thanks to Dudley of Yesterzine for chiming in on Twitter and helping me out with that. I would have never guessed that the opposing team was Cameroon, and I wasted at least 20 minutes trying to find a picture of a Brazil uniform with a white collar. Flipping over the back, and Accolade definitely made the most of their space back here. The header, no pun intended, looks straight out of a magazine ad, and the flavor text below is solid, with some great bullet points detailing the features of the game. Two things here stand out. Accolade apparently couldn't decide whether the field was slanted at a 30 or a 35 degree angle, which seems odd. That's kind of a one or the other type thing. And then also, the game apparently shipped with a writable ROM chip, similar to Micro Machines, rather than a battery backup. Which is interesting considering that I had to replace the battery on Hardball 3, so I wonder why they made the change. The screenshots look decent, and the angled field of course gives off FIFA vibes, so at least from the outside this looks like it might be a good game, but I guess time will tell on that. One last small thing that I noticed about the box, you see that even though they didn't put it on the front, the game does have Sega's VRC rating on the back, and that's because this is actually a licensed release from Sega, and not one of Accolade's unlicensed games. It just doesn't have the Sega seal anywhere. Opening up the box, and it looks pristine in here. The manual and the cartridge are both in fantastic shape, and this copy also has the warranty card and the send-away card for the free soccer ball mentioned on the front cover. Accolade just love their free giveaways with these games, balls, posters, whatever. The manual itself is fine. It's got plenty of information about the game and appears to fully explain everything, with the occasional screenshot and chart. It may not be the most important manual in the world, but it does have a nice little biography of Pele at the beginning, and I appreciate the effort that Accolade put in here. Okay, that's the package. Let's get to the game and attempt to play some soccer. Talking about Pele in the United States is a little different than around the rest of the world. And when I say that, I mean the man, not the game. It's pretty well known that soccer, while being a wildly popular youth sport in the United States, doesn't really have much of a following when it comes to a professional level. And I don't say that to insult any of the great players in MLS, but if you go to the average person on the street and you ask them who their favorite MLS player is, they're probably not going to have an answer for you. And honestly, you can count me in on that, because while I know a few players on the national team, those are all players that don't play in the United States professionally. And don't get me wrong, I don't dislike soccer, although I did do my best to pretend that the World Cup in Qatar didn't happen this year, just due to all the ugliness that was surrounding it. It's just that I have limited time to invest in sports, and since it's not basketball, football, or hockey, I just don't have the cycles to keep up with it. And I think this is what you run into with most people in the US my age and younger. We're not like the boomers and past generations that thought soccer was a junk sport for sissies. And by the way, you can quote that from my dad. But at the same time, when you're the fifth or maybe even sixth most popular sport, if you're in NASCAR territory, you're going to struggle to get people to watch and be invested in the product. So what does any of this have to do with Pele, you ask? Well, for years, Pele was the only soccer player that the average American knew. Sure, some people in the 80s probably were familiar with Maradona after the Hand of God occurred, and maybe some people also knew Franz Beckenbauer since he was the face of the New York Cosmos and the NASL after Pele retired, but neither of those guys were starring in prison escape movies with Sylvester Stallone. It's because of all this, I assumed incorrectly, that Pele, the Genesis game, was one of numerous soccer games that were branded using the soccer legend's name and likeness. But as it turns out, Pele is one of only 3 console games that bear his name. Along with this game, and its sequel Pele 2, the only other non-mobile game to bear Pele's name was Pele Soccer for the Atari 2600. And even that is debatable, as the game was originally released as Championship Soccer, and the Pele license was only added after the game was done. This puts Pele in the game in the unique position of being the first game truly developed and released with its namesake in mind. Seeing as how until a certain Lionel Messi came along, Pele was considered the no-question GOAT of soccer, attempting to launch a franchise based around his name would seem to be a pretty big deal, right? I mean, just to live up to that name, you'd have to release a soccer game that was at very least above average, or become a laughingstock. Well, if you're watching this video, you either already know or can guess how that went. But, and not to spoil things, after playing it for a few days now, I can honestly say it's not that bad. Certainly not bad enough to pull an Ozzysoft and refuse to release the game in Australia because you thought it was poor. If that last sentence confused you, Ozzysoft was a software distributor for the Australia region, and according to Sega Retro, they apparently took one look at Pele and said, nope. Honestly, I don't think that's necessarily an indictment on Pele as much as they knew it was going to get stomped by FIFA, and since they were releasing around the same time, it wasn't worth losing money on. Pele does do some odd things though, and it's probably best to run through all that now. I think the first thing that comes to mind is how unnecessary Pele was to the game. Accolade could have easily not paid Pele for the license and come up with some other name for the game, and it would have really only been affected in 2 ways. First, there were a few extremely grainy, and I mean extremely grainy, as in worse than Sega CD quality clips, of Pele in his playing days that appear occasionally when playing the game. These totally could have been replaced with other clips, or even just pulled entirely, as they really don't add much to the game. Then, Pele also makes an appearance in the formation selection screen, and gives a description of each of the selectable formations that you can have your squad in, with recommendations about their benefits, and possibly in what game situations they should be used in. This feels a bit like when John Madden would give advice in Madden Football, but of course on a much smaller level. It's a decent idea, and it makes sense. If you're going to learn from someone, you'd want to learn from the best, but at the same time, if Accolade had removed his picture from the screen, it really wouldn't have affected the game functionally. The next thing that stands out as a bit odd with this game is its team and tournament structure. Here, like the inclusion or non-inclusion of Pele, it's not necessarily bad, it's just different. Pele features a roster of 40 teams from 32 different countries divided into 4 regions, and this is where it seemed to try to differentiate itself from FIFA a bit. Now, I've got to stop for a second and discuss the names of these regions. The regions are used to divide up the teams in tournament and season mode, as you might expect, and all the teams are grouped geographically, sort of. First, there's the Americas region, which really should be called South America because all the teams are from that continent. Then there's Europe, which makes sense because all the teams do come from Europe, so okay, that's 2 that make sense. But here's where it gets weird. Next is the Mediterranean region, and you'd think that it would be just for countries like Italy, Portugal, maybe even Egypt. And it's got those, but it also includes all of the African teams, stretching all the way down to South Africa. Finally, there's the Pacific, and if Accolade was being honest, this region should have been named Miscellaneous, because that would have been more accurate. In the Pacific region, we've got teams that have a long association with the Pacific Ocean, like New York City, Veracruz and Mexico City, Mexico, and finally that sun-drenched Pacific paradise, Moscow. I get that ultimately it's not that important how the teams are split up, but this is insulting for anyone that's gone beyond 8th grade geography. As you probably got from the last section, you aren't playing with various countries' national teams, as Accolade apparently doesn't have those licenses. You're instead playing as teams from major cities that represent those countries.
It ends up feeling a bit like, rather than go after a World Cup style tournament, like what FIFA was doing, they instead were trying to go with something more of like a club-based and create some sort of worldwide Super Champions League instead. And if some of those soccer analogies are bad, just remember, I'm American. I don't hate this pseudo-Champions League setup because it's at least original. I already have FIFA, why do I need another game to do what it's already doing? Instead, the game has options for single-player exhibition matches, an 18-match league with cumulative scoring and simple stat tracking, and a single elimination ladder tournament that pits the 10 teams from each region against each other before a showdown between the champions of each region. I like the option of league versus tournament play, and being able to save your progress and not mess around with passwords is a huge plus. Now that all the Pele quirks are out of the way, how does the game actually play, since that's probably what's most important? Well, this is where the game loses points, unfortunately. However, let me hedge that by saying I've played sports games that play much, much worse. Pele is certainly a step above trash like NBA All-Star Challenge, Pro Quarterback, and Winter Olympic Games, the unholy trinity of sports games that I've run into thus far on the channel. Pele at least tries to resemble a functional soccer game. Each of the players have different statistics, and you'll know when you're playing a good team versus a bad team and vice versa. The game utilizes all three of the buttons on the controller for different types of kicks and defensive plays, and using the A button to switch between the player nearest the ball works pretty well. I have no major complaints about how the game plays. It might not be as polished as FIFA, but it gets the job done. Well, except for one gripe that I have, the goalkeepers. Apparently, the goalkeepers for each team are inhuman when it comes to direct shots on goal. No matter what you throw at the goalie, if it's a direct shot, it's getting stopped. There's no rebounds to take advantage of, as the goalie always grabs the ball and sends it back. This is somewhat frustrating, as it's just not realistic, and I had a rough time the first 5 games or so when I played, where I was getting shut out every game, except one time when I was able to take advantage of a penalty shot. What I ended up figuring out was that the only way to score is to take advantage of crosses, which would lead to getting the goalie out of position and physically unable to stop a shot from behind. And to be fair to the developers of Pele, this is a sound scoring strategy in real life, but it just shouldn't be the only way to score. From a graphics perspective, they're okay. FIFA is definitely a better looking game, but it's also double the size, from 8 megabits to 16 megabits, so it should be better looking. This is probably nitpicking, but I don't like in sports titles when everyone looks exactly the same. And that's what you could have here, as every player on a team, except the goalie, uses the same sprite. The players could have used a bit more animation too, as there are times when they almost seem like that they're skating down the field due to how quickly the field moves in comparison to their running. I do have to give the developers credit for one thing though, and that's the periodic display of the score and time. It's not shown the entire game as to allow the player to see the action better, and instead just pops up occasionally, and it will flip between the top and bottom of the screen depending on what's going on, as to not block things. This is a pretty slick feature, and I think other games could learn from it. The sound, like the graphics, is pretty mediocre. The music that plays during the menus and status screens is decent, but you won't hear it often, as during gameplay, you instead just get the occasional sound effect and white noise for the crowd, with the occasional chant thrown in depending on what's going on. I hate to compare it to FIFA again, but it's essentially a dumbed down version of what you would hear in that game, which again is to be expected with less available cartridge space. Pele is an interesting title. Just due to the occasional comment that I'd seen about the game, and some of the other poor sports titles that I've previously run into, I was expecting this game to just absolutely suck. But honestly, once you get used to its quirks, it's an interesting title, and I do enjoy seeing something that's not just the same old World Cup game. It has some nice customization options as far as each team's kit goes, and the 2-player mode goes well with the ability to save your games, giving 2 people the opportunity to compete in tournaments or season play, rather than just always having to play one another. As a result, I'm giving Pele 2 stars. It's not FIFA, but it's not horrible either, and it's definitely an improvement on something like World Championship Soccer.
Okay, and that was Pele for the Genesis. You know, I'm really glad that this game wasn't actually bad, and once I figured out how to score, I started to actually have some genuine fun with the game. Would I ever sit down and play a season of it? Probably not in 2023, but back in 93 or 94, I could have seen doing that. I do think naming the game Pele was probably a bit of a reach on Accolade's part, and they really should have included him more in the game for the name to make sense and not just be a blatant marketing gimmick. Who knows, maybe when I get to Pele 2, and yes, there is a Pele 2, you didn't dream that, but perhaps that game will have more involvement from the legend. Or less, I mean, who knows. I wouldn't put anything past mid-90s Accolade. Next week on Zilog and Moto, let's kick things up a notch, shall we? Maybe even throw some more bits onto the review? Yeah, I think it's time to review a game that actually has some arcade pedigree, but I'm willing to bet that probably only the most dedicated Sega fans even know this specific game exists, and even the most basic trivia questions about it probably would have them crying for their mother. You know what game I'm talking about? Yeah, you do. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 182. If you like what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.